Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with another juicy video, a juicy topic as always. Firstly, thank you to Steven Erikson for sharing the last three videos and for giving us that hat trick. We did it, guys. I'd also like to mention that someone posted a comment on my Anamander Rake video, and it was just so well argued and well thought out that I had to pin the comment on that page so that everybody could read it. This person is clearly a huge fan of Anamander Rake and disagrees with everything that I said in that video, but it was just so well done. This person makes general comments in response to the general criticisms that I have of Rake, and also makes specific rebuttals to the specific criticisms that I had about Rake. So if any of you want to see a sort of superb counter argument to the video that I made on Anamander Rake, then you now need to go back to the video that I made on Anamander Rake, and you will see the comment posted there, right? It can almost be a companion piece, so to speak, to my video, because ultimately I want the goal of this content to be to create conversation and not debate, right? So with all that compassion and empathy out of the way, we come to today's topic: the psychology of tyranny, the thought process of totalitarianism. Now, there are obviously different types of tyranny that we see in the books, and those themes are kind of explored in all 10 books. But our focus today is Karos Invictad. Who? Good question. It's the bad guy in Reaper's Gale, the leader of the patriotists, who are this Gestapo type secret police in leather, right? The guy who likes solving puzzles, not the other guy who his deputy, not the guy who likes to torture and imprison women and all that, the genius, right? What makes the character of Karos Invictad so sort of fascinating is that the guy is straight out of an Orwellian world, right? Of an Orwellian nightmare. And Erikson uses him to show us a side of Orwellian thought that even Orwell doesn't, right? So let me explain. Now, George Orwell, as all of you know, is most well known for writing Animal Farm and 1984, right? Two books that journalists, scholars, public intellectuals, political commentators still quote to this day. His essay that he wrote in 1946, which is Politics and the English Language, is still one of the most important essays in terms of understanding propaganda, indoctrination, and things like that, right? The term Orwellian itself is used very often today to describe situations which are perhaps destructive to free societies. Most people recognize words like doublethink and big brother, right? These are kind of famous words, and this is all because of the legacy of George Orwell's work. In terms of dissecting and discrediting totalitarianism, to me, he is the pinnacle of a writer, right? And there are courses that are taught on Orwell. There are PhDs that you can do on Orwell, PhDs that have been done and can be done, right, on his work, because there's so much there. All this attention is deserved as well, because Orwell was a singularly brilliant guy in many ways. And what I mean by that is, in two tiny books, right, just two really, really tiny books, he dismantles fascism, communism, and imperialism, which were the three dominant ideologies of power in the 20th century. Even though he identified as a socialist, he was the first to kind of make it clear that all sides of the political spectrum were equally vulnerable to the corruption of power. But to me, the one thing that I always wanted from Orwell and didn't get was a psychological portrait of tyranny, right? We know what it's like to see these dystopias from the eyes of the victim, right? Most of them unaware that they are victims. But what about from the eyes of the perpetrators? What about the puppet masters who kind of orchestrate this in the back? In Animal Farm, for example, even though we are supposed to know that Snowball is Trotsky and Napoleon is Stalin and all of that, we don't really get into the minds of the pigs. In 1984, even though we just see what it's like for Winston to live in this dystopian society, but we get very little into the sort of the orchestrators of the Big Brother sort of way of thinking, right? So who came up with this? How did they come up with it? How does that person's mind function? There are so many questions that we can ask about the mind of an Orwellian totalitarian, which we never really get, right? So like Are they well-intentioned or are they crooks? Do they have an ideological rationale for the things that they do, or are they compelled by other things? Do they understand the depth of just how cynical what they are doing is, or do they genuinely believe that it's all for the greater good? We hardly get the answers to these questions from Orwell's work, right? There's a passage in 1984 where Winston is told that the party pursues power for the sake of it, but we don't really get much more than that. This is deliberate, by the way, because Orwell, as Christopher Hitchens points out in his book, Why Orwell Matters, is not really interested in power, he's interested in compliance. And what I mean by that is, he's far more interested in why we obey power rather than in the thought process of power itself. Because to him, that was a natural thing. It was a completely natural thing that those in power will kind of want to exercise it and oppress people, and therefore he never really seems to feel the need to explore it the way he explores why and how you and I as ordinary citizens might kind of fall prey to manipulation from the top. So here's where Erikson steps in, and Erikson offers us answers to some of those questions that I just mentioned, because he gives us a character who is someone who's truly Orwellian, right? Erikson says this is how these people think. This is the worldview of these people. This is the logical framework of these people. And it's a great sort of addition, I think, to the conversation on totalitarianism itself, because it's a kind of deconstruction of the worldview of a totalitarian, particularly an Orwellian totalitarian. So to explore this even deeper, Erikson has Karos Invictad in the midst of writing a treatise when we see him in Reaper's Gale, right? We keep hearing that he's working on this big book on how a police state ought to be created and controlled and maintained. And I guess it's like Kautilya's Arthashastra and Sun Tzu's The Art of War and Machiavelli's The Prince, right? This sort of big monumental document on statecraft that he wants to write with clear strategic principles. And using this as a plot device, Erikson gives us a lot of really deep insight into the psychology of tyranny, into the psychology of an Orwellian. Many of those questions that I listed earlier that some of us might have about kind of these tyrannical masterminds and Orwellian masterminds, Erikson attempts to answer that through this character. And in that sense, this video is not just for fans of the Malazan series. This video could also be for fans of George Orwell, even students of George Orwell, right? So let's look at some of the major principles that characterize his thinking. Invictad firstly calls these principles the perfect laws of compulsion and control, right? So, which immediately gives us our first insight into this type of Orwellian tyranny, which is that Karos sees all of this as a science and not an art. He sees the act of controlling a population as a discipline, much like physics or chemistry or whatever, where there are fixed laws and you can apply those fixed laws and get the same result every time. So the sort of the discounting of humanity and the discounting of the individuals that you might encounter in the implementation of this model, none of that really matters to him, right? So when we look at his ideology itself, the first thing we see is what he feels about the nature of power. Now, this is a direct quote from him and it's complex, so we need to read it first and then break it down, right? So here's what he says. Power shapes the face of the world. In itself, it is neither benign nor malicious. It's simply the tool by which its wielder reshapes all that is around him or herself. So he clearly understands that power is a tool and that by itself it is neither evil nor noble, right? But he knows that it can be used, it can be wielded to shape the things around you, to reshape the things around you. Now, if this sounds suspiciously like the Malazan magic system to you, you're probably right. If this sounds like the Warren system to you, you're probably right, because the magic system of Malazan is probably a metaphor for power, right? But before this spirals into that discussion, what we need to remember here is that the totalitarian, the dictator, the sort of Orwellian mastermind has a deeply functional understanding of power, as opposed to an ideological understanding of power, right? He thinks of power in the same sense that mages in the series would think of warrens, something that you draw energy from and then you reshape that energy, right, into whatever you want. He also then adds that power can be either soft and subtle or cruel and hard. So this carrot and stick game that we see totalitarian regimes playing all the time. He identifies how you need to use fear and divide and conquer at the same time in order to kind of enforce control over a population. One of the major themes in Orwell's books is how easily totalitarian regimes can play this divide and conquer game. And here Erikson, with his sort of dialogue of Invictad, crystallizes it, right? And because his prose is so great, it conveys so much. And here it is. This is Karos Invictad kind of explaining how you exercise control over a population, right? Take any segment of population, impose strict yet clear definitions on their particular characteristics, then target them for compliance. Bribe the weak to expose the strong, kill the strong, and the rest are yours. Move on to the next segment, right? So this is what he says. So let's break it down. First, he says, you can take any population and you can impose strict rules on them, not just generic rules, right? But rules that are tailored for their characteristics. And then you target them for not complying with those rules. So that's his model for a reign of terror, right? Simultaneously, what you do is you bribe the weak to expose the strong. That's the divide and conquer part. As in, you exploit the vulnerability of the weak and you turn them against the strong and you then kill the strong. The final part of this quote is the most revealing one, right? Where he says, after all that, right? He says, bribe them, blah, 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 right? Impose strict measures on them, blah, blah. He ends it with, move on to the next segment, right? So it's a kind of model where you can move from segment, from society to society to society. And we've seen totalitarian regimes do this. We've seen totalitarian regimes pit societies against each other by not only creating fear about the state, but by creating suspicion against each other. And it's usually done by exploiting the weak and by turning them against the strong. Another Orwellian trait that Erikson emphasizes is the kind of the patriotists themselves, right? And how they stand for the weaponization of words. So the word patriotists itself, right, is a great example of this, where they use the term patriot as a shield, as a disguise to hide their authoritarianism. It's reminiscent of 1984, where the Ministry of Propaganda is called the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of War then turns out to be the Ministry of Peace turns out to be what could be the Ministry of War, right? So it certainly evokes all that. In addition to that, we also see words like sedition and treason being kind of used like weapons, even when they make no sense. So there are many moments in the book where people ask, sedition against what? Treason against what? Right? Nobody is revolting against the Idur. The Idur have an immortal emperor. None of us are trying to overthrow that guy. So what are you arresting us for? What are you terrorizing us for? You arrest us for sedition, for treason. But what sedition? What treason? We are up against an unstoppable foreign emperor. There's nothing that any of us can or will say about them. And yet, most of the patriotists' prisoners are for sedition and treason. Right now, just parallel that once again to dictatorships all over the world even today. And look at how, especially sedition, right, is used so easily to throw dissidents in jail, right? Where the standard of proof is so low and where even the laws that regulate it make it so easier for the state to control a citizen for being a dissident, right? Over this charge of sedition. Invictad, and I guess by effect the Orwellian way of thinking, sees skepticism as the ultimate enemy. And this was one of my kind of favorite parts about this, because Invictad once again says, right, that the people with conviction are easy to fool. It doesn't matter which side of the political aisle they fall on. As long as their minds are capable of conviction, they can be won over by your side, either with force or bribery or manipulation or whatever. But the skeptics, they're the dangerous ones, right? He says. And here's the quote that he says. Our greatest enemies are those who are without certainty, the ones with questions, the ones who regard our tidy answers with unquenchable skepticism. Those questions assail us, undermine us, right? So it's the ones who are skeptical of the state's narrative, whom these guys consider to be the biggest enemies. It's the ones who are kind of who are skeptical of the state's explanation of events, whom they see as the ultimate enemy. Now, notice how perfectly this falls into the whole Orwellian theme, right? In both Animal Farm and 1984, who sees through the machinations of these totalitarian regimes? It's the skeptics. In Animal Farm, Snowball sees through it and then gets chased off the book, right? Halfway through the book, never to return. And in 1984, it's Winston who is skeptical and sees through it, and finally at the end is kind of brainwashed again. So even if we go by Orwell's work as a kind of blueprint to verify whether Invictad was right or not, I would say he was right, in the sense that he identifies the skeptics as the most dangerous one. Invictad is also very clear about the political game and very clear on how the people screeching at both sides of the political aisle are usually the same types of people, right? And here again, we get a great quote from him. He refers to people on both sides of politics, right? Both extremes of the political spectrum reveal a convergence of the means and methods, and indeed the very attitudes of the believers. Their ferocity against naysayers, the blood they willingly spill for their cause, defending their version of reality. So, in terms of living in a bubble, having no tolerance for disagreement, having no tolerance for civil debate, this readiness to see themselves as kind of noble revolutionaries, he identifies all that. And how often do we see this in the real world? Pretty much all the time. I mean, how often do we see people squabbling over their own political allegiances, and people kind of siding with their own sort of political parties that they vote for, and both sides are convinced that they are on the right side of history. Both sides are convinced that the other side is evil, even though in the way that these people think, they are essentially very, very similar people, even though they would rail against that idea. And Invictad is kind of, as a strategist, he's smart enough to see that, right? The final real feature that we see from him that fits so well into this Orwellian discussion is his cynicism. And I really want to touch on that because this is another important thing that Erikson is telling us about tyrants, right? Erikson really shows Invictad as someone who understands the game. He isn't ideological in any way. He's the perfect example of an Orwellian or a tyrant who seeks power simply for the sake of it. We see people under him like Sirin Khanna who fall for that, right? Who fall for what Karos says about them being the righteous and the virtuous and all that. But Karos himself knows that this is not true. And I think there's a great warning from Erikson for anybody who kind of gets too passionate about party politics and political debates online and things like that, because we see it all the time, right? The people in the middle and the bottom rungs of society are the ones who are the most vocal about fighting over their pet political causes and their parties and things like that. And the people at the top usually tend to profit from all this. And the people at the top, regardless of what party identity they might have, often end up being the same people, right? And they harbor, most of them harbor none of the ideals that the people at the middle rung and the lower rungs sort of harbor. And I think that's very important for us to keep in mind. Now, I'll give you an example of his cynicism, right? Because I have a quote here. So he talks to a bunch of new recruits who come to this Gestapo, right? AKA the Patriotists. And this is what he says. He says, "Our enemies are legion. This war, it will last forever. And it is our task to ensure that, so that we are never expendable," right? Some of the dumber recruits don't get this and just think, wow, he's clever. But just think of what he's saying, right? He says, we are under constant war, and it's our job to make sure that we are under constant war, because if we are not, we wouldn't be needed anymore. And this reveals the real core of the man and the real heart, I would say, of Orwellian thinking as well. This is where it's not just simple tyranny, it's tyranny that's propped up through manipulation. And that is what we kind of really call Orwellian, where they say, look, they tell the people, you are surrounded by enemies and we are the only ones who can save you from those enemies. So in order for us to pursue the noble sort of objective of protecting you, you now need to give us even more power, right? So you create enemies, you convince the population that you're the only one who can save them from these enemies, and in return you're in this cycle of never-ending sort of acquisition of power, right? A kind of key scene that captures all the traits from him is an early scene where there's a prisoner screaming in pain, and uh, uh, Invictad talks to Tanel Yatvanar, his second in command, right, the sexual psychopath, and he says, look, I can just magnify the physical torture of this one man into mental torture for all the other prisoners. So he just lets the guy who's getting tortured, he just lets him scream. And there are other prisoners who can hear this and who are terrorized by this, right? And who break, because even before they've been tortured, they hear these screams and they say, I don't want to meet the whatever fate it is that befell this guy, right? And they're ready to cooperate. So this is what he says, right? This is what he says about that man who's screaming downstairs. He says, listen to that man. He does my work for me. Down in the dungeons, his cellmates hear his ravings, and some among them join in chorus. The guards take note of whom, and that is a list of names I peruse daily, for they are the ones I can win over, right? So he just says, listen, I let the tortured guy scream, and he does all my work for me by inflicting this fear, right, on everyone else, on his cellmates. And Invicta then makes the prison guards take note of the people who are terrorized the most. He makes them take note of the people who are horrified by this the most, and he knows that these are the guys that he can now win over. These are the guys that he can now kind of brainwash into his way of thinking. That scene to me really encapsulated all of what we've discussed so far, right? From his understanding of power as a tool to this whole notion that fear can be used to wage psychological warfare, that physical damage can be used to amplify psychological and mental damage. This scene I thought was brilliant because it highlighted all that. What makes the exploration in this book even more fun is the nemesis that Invicta gets in the book, right? Who in all 10 books is the perfect protagonist to face off against Orwellian thinking? Of course, my boy Tehol, right? Who was the kind of perfect enemy for this way of thinking. And he has the best line in the book, if not the best line in the series, right? Which is, he says, tyranny has no sense of humor. That is such a short and simple line, but it's so brilliant and it contains so much truth in it, right? Tyranny has no sense of humor. This is why Tehol and Bouchelain and all these guys are among my favorite characters, because there are some people that Erikson writes where every time they open their mouth, it like just blows your mind, right? And that's a great thing about the show. This lack of humor in Tyranny, which kind of is embodied in Invictad, we finally see this when they meet, right? And Tehol is Karos's prisoner, and Karos basically says, oh, humor's pointless, it serves no purpose. And Tehol says, no, what are you talking about? Being funny is one of the most important traits, demonstrations of intelligence, right? Because you need to understand so much about human nature. You need to understand so much about the world to be funny. And Karos Invictad has absolutely none of it. He's like, humor is pointless. And Tehol keeps saying, in that case, I'm smarter than you, right? Because I'm funnier than you. And in the ultimate joke, where Erikson really drives home the point of humor being the arch nemesis of totalitarianism, notice how the clash between them goes, right? So Karos is a master of puzzles, and he gets puzzles sent to him from all over, and he wants to break them in record time. He's a master at it, and he keeps breaking all kinds of records. So Tehol sends him this puzzle, and I'm sure you all recall that, right? It's a two-headed insect in a box, and it just keeps going round and round. And there are these tiles that can be rearranged. So the object is you need to stop the insect from going round and round, but you can't touch it, right? So Invictad assumes that you need to rearrange these tiles, right? And one of the kind of combinations will get the insect to stop, right? And finally, when it happens, it's so funny because throughout the book, we see Karos slowly getting consumed by this puzzle, right? We see him getting obsessed by this. And when Tehol finally shows him how it's done, Tehol just blows on one of the kind of glass tiles outside, and it fogs up with his breath. And for a second, the insect just stops, it scratches its belly, and then it keeps resuming its journey, right? So that was the puzzle. And this scene is a metaphor for why the best remedy to totalitarianism is humor, because this puzzle that Invictad was consumed with the whole time, it was a joke. This whole time, it was a gag. And what makes it even funnier is that he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand why it's funny, because Tyranny has no sense of humor, right? And he has nothing to say or do other than just bludgeon Tehol with this scepter that he has, because even though he can now beat him up physically, the battle of wits is lost, right? The important battle between the two was this, and Tehol won that. The scepter that he uses itself is a pretty interesting part of him. Whenever Erikson sort of gives a character some distinct trait, there's usually something more that we can read into it, right? So Invictad is always in crimson silks, and sort of he always wears crimson, which I just took for, it stands for whatever, violence, blood, blah, 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 right? But what interested me more was the scepter that he carries, because the scepter and the way he uses it in the book is a combination of mental warfare and physical warfare, right? On the one hand, the scepter serves its purpose for the mental side of making him look more regal and authoritative, and he even kind of throughout the book uses the scepter to kind of act and talk in this pompous way, right? But on the other hand, when he loses his temper, he also uses that same scepter for physical destruction, to just beat people. So it's a metaphor, I think, for Orwellian power, much like Orwellian power itself, which can be both physical and psychological. So the scepter kind of stands for that, right? It combines the two. So that is the character portrait, guys, the psychological profile of Karos Invictad, which is in return Erikson's psychological profile of what an Orwellian would think, of what an Orwellian mastermind would think. I think it's a fantastic contribution to the general discourse on Orwellian themes, right? Because let's face it, George Orwell does kind of prove that fiction in many ways is a much better instigator of discussion, and it teaches us a lot more about the reality of the world that even non-fiction can. And isn't this what Erikson does as well, right? Isn't this what Erikson tries to kind of achieve with his fiction as well, of elevating it to that point where we can now draw out our own themes from it and kind of derive some kind of meaning from it, right? Because creating a tyrant is easy. Anybody can do that, right? Creating a despicable villain who just oppresses people is easy. Anybody can do that. What's difficult, what's much harder, is articulating such a horrible person's rationale in such a clear and concise manner, and to give us an insight into how they think, right? Because the Orwellian mastermind is something that is shown, the trope is shown in many types of fiction and literature, but it's never really dissected in such a clear and intellectual way as Erikson does using Karos Invictad, right? And in general, stuff like this, of getting into the head of someone to the point where we can then start drawing lessons from it. That has always been, as you guys know, one of Erikson's big strengths when it comes to characterization, right? So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I sort of, if like me, you've always wondered what the psychology and the thought process of these tyrants are, particularly these Orwellian tyrants, then I hope that this character study of Karos Invictad gave you some stuff to think about, right? Because when I read it, it certainly gave me a lot of stuff to think about. So thank you guys, and see you next time.